January 1942. High above the Pacific, the sky is clear and mercilessly blue. A Japanese naval pilot scans the horizon from his cockpit. Below him, the ocean stretches endlessly empty, silent, seemingly powerless. In briefing rooms across the empire, confidence has become routine. America, they are told, is distant, soft, dependent. A nation that will bleed fuel long before Japan ever does. Early victories reinforce the belief. Pearl Harbor burns. Wake Island falls. The Philippines begin to collapse. Fuel gauges still read full. Engines still roar. But far beyond their horizon, something unseen is already moving. Not fleets, not bombers, but oil measured not in barrels, but in oceans of steel tanks, pipelines, refineries, and rail cars. At first, Japanese pilots laugh at the idea of American endurance. They will not be laughing for long, because this war will not be decided in the air alone, but in the fuel that keeps the air alive. By the time the Pacific War erupted in December 1941, fuel had already become the most decisive resource on Earth. Modern warfare no longer moved at the speed of marching men. It moved at the speed of engines. Battleships consumed thousands of tons of oil per day. Fighter aircraft burned fuel in minutes. Entire offensives now depended not on courage, but on supply. Japan understood this reality partially. The empire possessed skilled pilots, advanced aircraft, and a battle-hardened naval doctrine. But it lacked one thing it could never replace: oil. By 1941, Japan imported more than 80% of its petroleum. The majority came from the United States, the Dutch East Indies, and British-controlled territories. When the U.S. imposed its oil embargo in July 1941, Japan's reserves could sustain full-scale war for roughly 18 months, no more. American planners knew this. Japan did too. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a strike against battleships. It was a gamble to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet long enough to seize the oil fields of Southeast Asia and force America into negotiation before its industrial engine could awaken. Across the Pacific, the United States stood in stark contrast. America was not merely an oil producer. It was the oil producer. In 1941, the U.S. supplied over two-thirds of the world's petroleum. Its refineries stretched from Texas to California. Its pipelines crossed continents. Its reserves were so vast that fuel shortages were considered theoretical. Yet Japanese intelligence underestimated this imbalance. They measured American willpower, not American capacity. In early war briefings, U.S. logistics were dismissed as slow, inefficient, and vulnerable. Distance, Japanese commanders believed, would do what bombs could not. They assumed American aircraft would fly less, sail less, fight briefly. This assumption would become fatal, because while Japan fought with precision and bravery, America prepared for something else entirely. Endurance. And endurance begins long before the first shot is fired. While Japan raced against time, the United States quietly prepared for a war without a finish line. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, American industry shifted into a state of controlled acceleration. Refineries expanded. New oil fields were drilled at unprecedented speed. Pipelines once regional became national arteries, the most ambitious of them. The Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines were constructed to move Texas oil directly to the East Coast. Beyond the reach of German submarines, fuel was no longer treated as a commodity. It became a weapon. Every new aircraft design reflected this reality. American fighters were built with longer range, heavier fuel loads, and easier maintenance. The P-38 Lightning crossed oceans. The B-24 Liberator carried war thousands of miles from its origin. Even naval doctrine-adapted task forces now operated as mobile fuel-consuming systems, supported by an expanding fleet of oilers that allowed ships to refuel at sea. Japan could not match this. Its tankers were few. Its refineries were limited. Its pipelines vulnerable. Every mile flown, every sortie launched, drew down reserves that could not be replaced at the same rate. Still, in the first year of the war, Japanese pilots felt little of this pressure. Their aircraft were light, agile, and deadly. Early American losses reinforced the belief that fuel advantage meant nothing if skill decided the fight. But by mid-1942, the illusion began to crack. At battles like Coral Sea and Midway, American carriers returned again and again, refueled, rearmed, relentless. Planes thought destroyed reappeared weeks later. New squadrons replaced lost ones almost instantly. For Japanese airmen, something felt wrong. The enemy was not slowing. Engines never seemed to rest. And the sky, once briefly conquered, no longer belonged to anyone. As the war pushed deeper into the Pacific, fuel stopped being an abstract calculation. It became a countdown. In the early months of the Pacific War, Japanese pilots flew with absolute confidence. Many were veterans of China, hardened by years of combat. Their aircraft were light, maneuverable, and lethal. Fuel efficiency mattered less when victory seemed imminent. Briefings emphasized speed and decisiveness. The war, they were told, would be short. America would not endure sustained losses so far from home. Long-range logistics were considered a weakness, not a strength. Too many pilots, American aircraft looked heavy, inelegant, overbuilt. They assumed those machines paid for their size and endurance. They were wrong. American fuel dominance was not accidental. It was engineered. By 1942, U.S. refineries were producing aviation gasoline at volumes Japan could not even estimate. Specialized high-octane fuels gave American engines more power, more reliability, and longer operational life. More importantly, fuel delivery became systematic. Oilers followed fleets. Airfields were stocked months in advance. No mission launched without a margin for error. For Japan, every flight consumed a resource that could not be wasted. For America, fuel was something to be spent. American aircraft reflected strategic patience. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced losses. Drop tanks extended range. Engines were built to survive long hours, not short duels. Japanese pilots noticed it first in combat. American planes didn't turn as tightly, but they kept coming. They could retreat, refuel, and return the next day. The sky was beginning to change. At the highest levels of Japanese command, Fuel calculations were treated as fixed limits, not variables. Leaders planned operations around existing reserves, assuming decisive victories would secure new sources before shortages emerged. There was little margin for failure. American leadership thought differently. Admiral Chester Nimitz and U.S. naval planners treated fuel as something to be multiplied through planning, not conserved through fear. Replenishment groups were integrated into every major operation. If distance increased, supply followed. This difference in mindset shaped everything that came next. Japanese intelligence consistently underestimated American recovery speed. New carriers appeared faster than expected. Aircraft losses were absorbed without pause. Even after heavy defeats, American operations intensified rather than slowed. To Japanese aviators, it felt unnatural. An enemy should weaken. America did not. By late 1942, the mood among Japanese aircrews had changed. Fuel rationing began quietly. Training hours were reduced. Replacement pilots flew fewer practice missions. Veterans noticed engines being shut down earlier. Missions planned with tighter margins. Confidence gave way to calculation. The laughter never official, never recorded faded into silence. And silence, in war, often arrives just before collapse. That realization would crystallize in a series of battles where fuel, not firepower, would decide survival. The turning point did not arrive with a single explosion. It arrived gradually, measured in empty tanks and grounded aircraft. By mid-1943, the Pacific War had stretched far beyond Japan's original calculations. The Solomons, New Guinea, and Central Pacific campaigns forced aircraft and ships to operate at extreme distances. Each sortie consumed fuel that could no longer be replaced at the same pace. American forces, meanwhile, grew stronger with distance. At Guadalcanal, U.S. aircraft flew repeatedly from well-supplied airfields. Damaged planes were repaired, refueled, and returned to combat within days. Japanese aircraft, operating from distant bases or carriers, flew at the edge of their range. Pilots were ordered to fight without drop tanks, sacrificing return fuel for performance. Many never came back. By 1944, American long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang and carrier aircraft equipped with external tanks transformed the air war. Missions once impossible became routine. Bombers reached targets deep within Japanese-held territory and returned with fuel to spare. Japanese pilots noticed something terrifying. American aircraft no longer withdrew after contact. They lingered, they hunted, they waited. Fuel superiority had turned the sky into a trap, and Japan had begun to run out of time. The moment of realization arrived not in command rooms, but in the air. During the Marianas campaign in June 1944, Japanese pilots launched wave after wave against American carrier groups. The Americans would later call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for Japan. It was something far worse. Pilots took off knowing their fuel loads allowed no margin. Some aircraft carried just enough to reach the enemy, nothing more. There would be no second engagement. No long pursuit, no return if damaged. American pilots flew differently. They climbed higher, stayed longer, broke contact when they chose. Their carriers refueled continuously, protected by oilers operating just beyond the horizon. Aircraft landed, refueled, rearmed, and launched again while Japanese squadrons simply ceased to exist. Survivors reported the same shock. The enemy did not retreat. The enemy did not tire. American engines kept running. By late 1944, Japan's fuel situation collapsed entirely. Training flights were reduced 2 minutes. New pilots entered combat with barely enough fuel experience to land safely. Some units hoarded gasoline like medicine. Others received none at all. In the final months, aircraft were sometimes fueled only for one-way missions. At that point, the war was no longer about victory. It was about how long an engine could keep turning. And for Japan, the answer was no longer long enough. The collapse of Japan's fuel system did not happen overnight. It unraveled. By 1945, Allied submarine warfare had strangled Japanese shipping. Tankers were sunk faster than they could be built. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, once the prize of the early war, could no longer reach the home islands in meaningful quantities. Refineries sat idle. Airfields fell silent. Reports from Japanese commands became increasingly grim. Aircraft were grounded not because of damage, but because there was nothing left to pour into their tanks. Pilots trained on simulators, bicycles, and classroom diagrams, anything that did not require gasoline. Meanwhile, American fuel consumption reached levels previously unimaginable. U.S. carrier task forces operated continuously for months. Fleets crossed entire oceans without stopping. Aircraft flew patrols not because they had to, but because they could. The imbalance reshaped the battlefield. American air superiority became absolute. Japanese aircraft that did take off were often intercepted before reaching their targets. Even defensive missions were limited by fuel rationing. Some bases could launch only a handful of sorties per day. The war had become one-sided, not in courage, but in capacity. And capacity, once lost, could not be recovered. As Japan's fuel reserves vanished, so did its ability to fight a modern war. In the final year, aircraft production continued, but planes without fuel were little more than metal shells. Engines were preserved like relics. Entire squadrons existed on paper only. When fuel did appear, it was often of poor quality, damaging engines and limiting performance. American pilots noticed the difference immediately. Enemy aircraft flew lower, slower, shorter missions. Many disengaged early, not from fear, but from necessity. Some never even searched for combat. By contrast, American aviation expanded its reach. Strategic bombing intensified. Long-range escorts became standard. Air superiority was no longer contested, it was enforced. Japanese post-war assessments were blunt. The loss of fuel meant the loss of initiative, training, morale, and ultimately survival. No tactic could overcome an enemy who could fly endlessly while you counted every drop. The war ended not with silence in the skies, but with American aircraft still circling, engines running, fuel gauges far from empty. What had once been mocked as American excess had become the decisive weapon, and the laughter, if it ever existed, had long since disappeared. Wars are often remembered for their battles, but they are decided by what allows battles to continue. In the Pacific, courage was never in short supply on either side. Skill, sacrifice, and innovation existed everywhere. What separated victory from defeat was something quieter, less visible, more relentless. Fuel. The United States did not win the air war because its pilots were braver or its planes more agile. It won because it could keep flying when others could not, because its engines never waited, because its supply lines did not break under distance. Japan entered the war believing speed would replace endurance. America proved the opposite. In the end, the Pacific skies were not conquered by fire alone, but by preparation measured in years, infrastructure measured in continents, and reserves measured beyond imagination. When engines stopped turning, history chose its outcome, and it chose the side that could afford to keep the war alive.